Principle number 3, Secular Leaps of Faith. A few years ago, CNN published an article titled, "Why I Raise My Children Without God." Instantly, it went viral. The author, a young mother named Deborah Mitchell, listed several reasons why she shielded her children from learning about God, most of them variations on the problem of evil. Mitchell argued that a loving God would not allow murderers, child abuse, wars, brutal beatings, torture, and millions of heinous acts to be committed throughout the history of mankind. The classic Christian answer to the problem of evil is that God created humans with free will, and they have made a horrific mess of things. This is called the free will defense, and it acknowledges the tragic reality of sin and suffering, while at the same time affirming human dignity. It portrays humans as genuine moral agents whose choices are so significant that they alter the direction of history, and even eternity. Having rejected the Christian answer, what did Mitchell offer as an alternative? She proposed a materialistic worldview in which humans are completely determined without free will. We are just a very, very small part of a big, big machine, she intoned. And the influence we have is minuscule. We must accept the realization of our insignificance. Is that meant to be an appealing alternative to Christianity? That humans are little machines trapped in a big machine? That their actions are insignificant? Mitchell claimed that her materialist view leads to humbleness. But it is not humbling, it's dehumanizing. It essentially reduces humans to robots. More importantly, it is not true. Its view of humanity runs counter to the data of the human experience. All civilizations throughout history have recognized that humans are moral agents capable of making responsible choices. There is no society without some moral code. The testimony of universal human experience is that humans are not merely little robots. After all, what is a worldview intended to explain? A worldview is meant to give a systematic explanation of those inescapable, unavoidable facts of experience accessible to all people, in all cultures, across all periods of history. In biblical terms, those facts constitute general revelation. Philosophers sometimes refer to them collectively as the life world, or lived experience, or pre-theoretical experience. The whole point of building theoretical systems is to explain what humans know by pre-theoretical experience. That is the starting point for any philosophy. That is the data it seeks to explain. If it fails to explain the data of experience, then it has failed the test. It has been falsified. The gravity of fact. You might think of this as the practical test of a worldview. Just as scientists test a theory by taking it into the lab and mixing chemicals in a test tube to see if the results confirm the theory, so we test a worldview by taking it into the laboratory of ordinary life. Can it be lived out consistently in the real world, without doing violence to human nature? Does life function the way the worldview says it should? Does it fit reality? Does it match what we know about the world? We could say that the purpose of a worldview is to explain what we know about the world. If a worldview contradicts our fundamental experience of the world, what we know by general revelation, that is a good sign that it should be scrapped. As Deweyard put it, every philosophy ought to be confronted with the datum of naive experience in order to test its ability to account for this datum in a satisfying manner. Any philosophy that cannot account for this datum in a satisfactory way must be erroneous. Philosopher J.P. Moreland says, "We test worldviews by how well they explain recollectorian facts. Those stubborn facts that every theory must explain, or else be considered falsified." And we can be confident that all idol-centered worldviews will be falsified. All will fail to account for at least some of those stubborn facts. Why? Because as we learned in principle number 2, they are reductionistic. They try to define the whole in terms of a part. Inevitably, their conceptual categories will be too narrow and limited. Some parts of reality will stick out of the box. Consider the CNN article that went viral. It proposed a materialist philosophy that reduces humans to machines determined by material forces. What sticks out of the box? Human freedom. The undeniable fact is that humans do make choices. This fact serves as evidence that a person is not a very, very small part of a big, big machine. Instead, humans are personal beings capable of willing and choosing, which means their origin must be a personal being, not the blind forces of nature. Recall that in philosophy, personal does not mean warm and friendly. It means being with the capacity to think, feel, choose, and act, in contrast to a non-thinking substance whose action is automatic. Consider what happens when you combine sodium with chlorine. The atoms react with one another to produce sodium chloride, table salt. The atoms do not make a conscious decision to interact. They do not choose to transfer electrons to form an ionic bond. The process takes place by purely automatic physical forces. Materialism claims that human behavior can be likewise explained solely by physical forces at work in our brain chemistry. The existence of free will counters that theory. It constitutes evidence that humans were not created by automatic physical forces, but by a personal agent. It is ironic that people who reject Christianity, who think that without God they can finally be free, end up with philosophies that deny them human freedom. To become familiar with the practical test, we will walk through several examples. The benefit of working with examples is that you will learn to analyze the actual wording and reasoning used by secular thinkers in real-world situations. The most surprising thing we will discover is that many of them, when pressed, actually acknowledge that their own worldview does not fit the facts. The examples in this chapter will help you make the cause for using their own words. I, robot, we, machines. Do not be tempted to think that worldview questions like these are esoteric, irrelevant to ordinary people. When I was a teenager, I was already wrestling with the same questions raised by the young mother writing for CNN. After rejecting my Lutheran upbringing, I embraced physical and social determinism. I saw it as one more nail in the coffin of Christianity, for the Bible clearly teaches that humans exercise moral responsibility. See, I have set before you today life and good, death and evil. Therefore, choose life that you and your offspring may live. Deuteronomy 30:15 and 19. Of course, theologians debate the exact nature of human freedom. The Reformers Lutheran and Calvin emphasized that humans do nothing to contribute to salvation. The liberating message of the gospel is that we do not have to earn or work for salvation, that both justification and sanctification are by hearing with faith, as said in Galatians 3:2 and 5. But the Reformers did not mean that we cannot choose whether to have ham or turkey on our sandwich for lunch. By contrast, materialism holds that humans only think they are choosing ham or turkey. In reality, their behavior is driven by natural forces such as neurons firing in the brain, just like sodium reacting with chlorine. All Christians agree in rejecting this materialist conception of humans as mere robots or meat machines. The Bible teaches that humans are fallen sinners, but the fall did not make us less than human. It did not make us machines. Obviously, humans are not free to do anything we might dream up, because we are creatures and not the creator. We are also embedded within a physical universe and a social world. We each have a personal history that affects our choices. Yet, within those parameters, we have some range of genuine choice and accountability. Our actions are not simply links in a closed chain of casually connected physical events. We have the capacity to be first causes, starting a new chain of cause and effect. It was not until I went to L'Abri, however, that I heard cogent arguments in favor of free will. The arguments centered on the universality of human experience. The testimony of all known creatures through all the recorded history is that humans do exercise moral freedom and responsibility. From time to time, quirky individuals have raised objections, but civilizations as a whole cannot survive without the conviction that people can be held responsible for their actions. Even materialists often admit that, in practice, it is impossible for humans to live any other way. One philosopher jokes that if people deny free will, then when ordering at a restaurant, they should say, "Just bring me whatever the laws of nature have determined I will get." It seems that we are forced to accept the reality of free will. Humans are so constituted that they cannot function without it. It is one of those stubborn facts that we must be accounted for by any worldview. These are some of the arguments I encountered while studying at L'Abri. As a result, I began to seriously consider whether my deterministic worldview might be mistaken. It began to look as though humans do have the moral freedom after all, and if my worldview did not account for it, well, I needed to look for one that did. It was the beginning of an intellectual turnaround. Christianity began to look considerably more plausible. How can we make Christianity more plausible for our own friends and family members who are seekers, agnostics, or skeptics? Principle number 3. Test the idol. Does it contradict what we know about the world? We have worked through 2 principles in the worldview analysis. First, we identify its idol. Second, we identify its reductionism. Now, we will ask whether idol-centered worldviews fit the real world. Let's stay with the question of free will because it is so central to human dignity. The ability to choose from among alternatives makes a host of other distinctly human capacities possible. Creativity and problem solving, love and relationships. Robots do not love. Even rationality itself. If our minds are pre-programmed to hold an idea, then it is not a rational decision. Unless human beings are morally responsible, says the law professor Jerome Hall, justice is only a mirage. Unless humans have free will, we will not develop a sense of identity or self-worth, because everything I do is really the work of unconscious automatic forces. What is at stake is nothing less than our respect for persons, says one philosopher. For if determinism is true, then we are, in the final reckoning, merely playthings of fortune. Free will has thus become a stand-in for the range of human qualities that depend on it. If you take a course in Philosophy 101, your textbook is almost certain to include a section on free will versus determinism. In recent years, the topic has moved to the center stage in philosophy. Therefore, it is one of the most silent facts of general revelation that can be used in testing worldviews. Why secularists can't live with secularism. Let's practice applying principle number 3 to several examples, using secularists' own words and writings. An especially clear example is Galen Strawson, a philosopher who states that, with great bravado, the impossibility of free will can be proved with complete certainty. Yet, in an interview, Strawson admits that, in practice, no one accepts his deterministic view. To be honest, I can't really accept it myself, he says. I can't really live with the fact that from day to day. Can you, really? But if humans can't really live with the implications of a worldview, is it a reliable map to to reality? Watch for phrases like this as you read through other examples. Often they are clues that someone is trying to live out a worldview that does not fit the real world, that he or she has bumped up against one of the interactable facts that point to the biblical God. Moreover, Strawson insists that he is not alone, that even cognitive scientists who publish books and journal articles favoring determinism do not accept it as a workable theory to live by. They may accept it in their white coats, but I'm sure that they're just like the rest of us when they're out in the world, convinced of the reality of radical free will. In short, their practice contradicts what they profess. They are trapped in a cognitive dissonance. Strawson states the conflict in striking terms. Powerful, logical, and metaphysical reasons for supposing we can't have strong free will keep coming up against equally powerful psychological reasons why we can't help believing that we do have it. It seems that we cannot live our experience our choices as determined, even if determinism is true. What are the telltale phrases here? That there are ideas we can't help believing, that we cannot live on the basis of contrary ideas, and even if we think they are true. When a concept like free will keeps bubbling up inescapably and irresistibly, even in the mind of someone who disavows it, whose worldview directly denies it, that's a good clue that it is a truth of general revelation that is being suppressed. The created order refuses to fit inside the box of any idol-based worldview. No matter how hard people work to suppress their knowledge of God, creation itself keeps challenging them. Human life is a continual wrestling match with God and His created order, writes Thomas Johnson. When talking with skeptics and agnostics, we can show that their worldview fails to account for reality as they themselves experience it. The truths of general revelation cannot be ultimately suppressed. A worldview is like an internal map that guides us in navigating reality. Because idols deify a part of creation, they produce maps that cover only part of reality. As a result, in the course of ordinary life, humans keep walking off the map. It happens whenever they are compelled to believe in free will or moral responsibility or anything else not covered in their cognitive map. Whenever they cannot live with the map's cramped borders. Life itself keeps pushing them off their own map. No one can live consistently on the basis of such a limited worldview map. Double-minded secularists. Consider a few more real-life examples. In What Science Offers the Humanities, Edward Singerland identifies himself as an unabashed materialist and reductionist. A reviewer for the journal Science expressed hope that the book will initiate conversion experiences to a materialist worldview. Conversion experiences, and you wondered whether materialism could really be labeled a religion. Singerland argues that Darwinian materialism leads logically to the conclusion that humans are robots, that our senses of having a will or self or consciousness is an illusion. Yet he admits it is an illusion we find impossible to shake. No one can help acting like at some level they really feeling that he or she is free. We are constitutionally incapable of experiencing ourselves and other conspecific humans as robots. One section in his book is even titled, "We Are Robots, Designed Not to Believe That We Are Robots." Do you recognize the language of general revelation? It consists in those fundamental truths that humans can't help experiencing and feeling, even when those truths contradict their own worldview. In one passage, Singerland writes, were constituted in such a way that we unavoidably and inescapably experience the lived reality of being moral agents. How does Singerland propose to solve the contradiction between his lived reality and his deterministic philosophy? He does not even try. Instead, he says we need to pull off the trick of living with a dual consciousness, cultivating the ability to view human beings simultaneously under two descriptions, as physical systems and as persons. In other words, he inexplicably recommends constructing a mental dichotomy, two-story division, cultivating a dual consciousness with the persons, the free agents, and the physical systems, robots. Such compartmentalized thinking is what George Orwell famously called doublethink, and it functions here as a philosophical coping mechanism. When a worldview fails to account for all of reality, what do inherits do? Do they say, I guess my theory has been falsified. I'd better toss it out? Most people don't give up that easily. Instead, they suppress the things that their worldview cannot explain, walling them off into a conceptual area separate from reality, an upper story of useful fictions, wish fulfillment, illusions. A dual consciousness is a signal that contrary evidence from general revelation is being suppressed. As we saw in principle number 2, every non-biblical worldview ends up with some form of dual consciousness, or dualism. There will always be a contradiction between the realities it acknowledges, what fits into the box, and the realities that it denies, what sticks out of the box. A conflict between what it professes and what it suppresses. Losing total truth. The price of accepting such a sharp dichotomy, however, is the loss of a unified truth. Singerland's two views of the human person are logically contradictory. For if we really are robots operating by purely material causes, then freedom is impossible. There is no logically coherent, unified worldview that can encompass both these contradictory views of the human person. From time immemorial, people have held the idea of the unity of truth. The universe itself is an integrated, coordinated whole, and therefore the truth about the universe must be an integrated, coherent whole. We may not be able to see yet how it all fits together, but we know that two contradictory statements cannot both be true. Until roughly the 1930s, American higher education was based on what was explicitly called the unity of truth, the conviction that all the truths agreed and ultimately could be related to one another in a single system. Writes Harvard historian Julie Rubin. Yet today, even well-educated people have come to accept a contradictory, fragmented, two-story view of truth. On one hand, they embrace a worldview that is radically reductionistic. On the other hand, they cannot deny the truths pressed on them by everyday experience, the truths of general revelation. So they have done what earlier generations would have found unthinkable. They have given up the ideal of unified truth. A leap of doubt. Thinkers we have covered so far are surprisingly frank. They recognize the sharp contradiction between what they practice and what they profess. It is unusual, however, for people to be able to be so clear-sighted. Many stop short of working out the full implications of their worldview. They simply live with a patchwork of conflicting ideas. An effective strategy in apologetics is to help people see more clearly where their worldview really leads. When they realize that idol-centered worldviews fail the practical test, that insight may open them to the case for a biblical worldview. Consider Marvin Minsky of MIT. He is the best known for his pithy phrase that the human brain is nothing but a 3-pound computer made of meat. Obviously, computers do not have the power of choice. The implication is that neither do humans. Surprisingly, however, Minsky then asks, does that mean we must embrace the modern scientific view and put aside the ancient myth of voluntary choice? No, we can't do that. Why not? Minsky goes on to say, no matter that the physical world provides no room for freedom of will, that concept is essential to our models of the mental realm. We cannot ever give it up. We're virtually forced to maintain that belief, even though we know it's false. False is, that is, according to Minsky's materialistic worldview. This is an amazing case of Orwellian doublethink. Minsky says people are forced to maintain the conviction of free will, even when their own worldview tells them that it is false. Clearly, he is not referring to merely cultural customs or traditions that can differ from society to society. These are truths that humans cannot know. The inescapable fact is that we are personal beings constitutes evidence that our origin is a personal being. How does Minsky escape the force of that evidence? He reduces it to the status of a necessary falsehood. He moves it to the upper story of ancient myths we are forced to maintain, those necessary falsehoods, freedom of will. The scientific view, the computers made of meat, are on the bottom. This is nothing less than a secular leap of faith. Materialists start by affirming the lower story as an account of what is real and true. But when the facts of experience fail to fit their worldview, they take a leap of faith to the upper story and embrace those facts in an ambiguous manner as false, yet necessary beliefs. We must emphasize that this is a far cry from the biblical concept of faith. The Bible does not define faith as a leap into something that has no logical ground within its own worldview, a useful falsehood. When Paul writes, we walk by faith, not by sight, in 2 Corinthians 5:7, some Christians seem to think he is speaking metaphorically and means by faith, not by reason. But Paul is speaking literally, and he means sight, not material realities. Non-material realities are invisible. They cannot be seen. Faith is the evidence of things not seen, as said in Hebrews 11:1. It can take tremendous faith to act on the basis of realities we cannot see, but it is not a logical contradiction. Given the evidence, such actions can even be eminently reasonable, just as it is reasonable for physicists to count on the reality of forces and the fields they cannot see. The secular project leads to the suicide of the intellect and the disintegration of the person. By contrast, the Christian worldview is amazingly positive, affirming both the unity of truth and the holistic commitment of the thinking person. Atheism versus civilization. In Romans 1, Paul warns that idols lead to destructive behavior, to moral and social breakdown. Amazingly, some secular thinkers recognize the truth of Paul's warning. Philosopher Saul Smilinski is a determinist who regards free agency as an illusion. Yet he considers it a fortunate illusion because it makes civilized life possible. He urges society's elites to persuade people that they are responsible agents, though in reality they are not, in order to maintain a healthy sense of moral duty and responsibility. Otherwise, they could excuse hostile behavior by saying they had no choice in the matter. Free will is a necessary fiction, morally necessary, to undergird the social order. Smilinski summarizes by saying, we cannot live adequately with a complete awareness of the absence of free will. Thus, we ought to hold on to those central but incoherent and contradictory beliefs in the free will case. What are the telltale phrases that he is being challenged by general revelation? His admission that we cannot live on the basis of what his worldview teaches, that we ought to hold on to a contradictory belief in free will. Of course, Smolinski's materialistic worldview gives no basis for any moral ought, because the word implies that humans are capable of making moral choices. A review in his book points out that he is advocating a two-tiered system. There are those in the know, mostly philosophers and scientists, who realize the naturalistic truth about ourselves, and there are the rest of us, the vast majority, who must be misled as to our real nature, lest we become demoralized. When we hear people talk about ideas that are false, yet necessary for a humane social order, that is a signal that they have bumped up against the hard edge of a reality that does not fit into their worldview. They have stumbled upon the truths of general revelation, and they are seeking to suppress those truths by demoting them to useful fictions. It's remarkable how Paul's description in Romans 1 of the dynamics of suppression makes sense of the latest modern worldviews. Dawkins' intolerable worldview. The best known of the new atheists is Richard Dawkins. In his book, he argues that humans are merely survival machines, robot vehicles blindly programmed by their genes. Therefore, it makes no sense to hold anyone responsible for what they do. After all, he says, when a computer malfunctions, we do not punish it. We track down the problem and fix it. He urges an overhaul of the entire criminal justice system. Isn't the murderer or the rapist just a machine with a defective component? Dawkins likes to illustrate with an episode from the British comedy show Fawlty Towers, when Basil Fawlty's little red car won't start. First he scolds the car, like a parent with a disobedient child. Then he counts to 3. Finally, he picks up a branch and gives the car a good thrashing. Of course we laugh, Dawkins writes, but why don't we laugh at a judge who punishes a criminal? Doesn't a truly scientific, mechanistic view of the nervous system make nonsense of the very idea of responsibility? In Dawkins' mind, a person has no more freedom than a little red car. When a young man pressed him on the issue after a public lecture, however, Dawkins admitted that he does not practice what he preaches. He does not treat the very idea of responsibility as nonsense. He does hold people responsible for their actions. I blame people, and I give people credit. But don't you see that as an inconsistency in your views? The young man asked. Dawkins replied, I sort of do, yes, but it is an inconsistency that we sort of have to live with, otherwise life wouldn't be tolerable. It was an astonishing admission that in practice no one can live by the naturalistic worldview that he himself promotes, that its consequence would be intolerable. Einstein's dilemma. What we learn from these examples is that many prominent thinkers live a two-story or bipolar existence. In their professional work, they adopt a reductionistic philosophy that regards people as essentially little red cars. But when they leave their laboratories and go home for the day, they have to switch to a contrary paradigm in order to treat people justly and humanely, to avoid a life that is intolerable. Even the great Albert Einstein was caught in the same dilemma. On one hand, he writes, human beings in their thinking, feeling, and acting are not free, but as casually bound as the stars in their motions. Yet, on the other hand, he said, I am compelled to act as if free will exists, because if I want to live in a civilized society, I must act responsibly. Einstein's phrase, as if, is a giveaway that he is talking about an irrational leap of faith. The source of the phrase is the writings of Immanuel Kant. On one hand, Kant's thought science led to the conclusion that humans are elements in a vast machine operating by the laws of physics. On the other hand, he said, to the salvage morality, we must act as if we are free. And to ratify our moral standards, we must act as if God exists. And because morality makes no sense unless justice prevails in the end, we must act as if there is an afterlife. Otherwise, all moral laws are all to be considered as idle dreams. In Kant's view, it is impossible to know whether these theological teachings are true, but to encourage moral behavior, he said we must live as if they were true. The phrase "as if" signals a concept that has been moved to the upper story, living as if Christianity were true, what we accept as if, freedom, God, morality, afterlife. And down here, what we know is materialism and determinism. Ever since Kant, the phrase "as if" has come to signal truths that people are compelled to hold, even though they cannot account for those truths within their own worldview. They live as if Christianity were true, even though their worldview denies it. Instead of giving up their worldview in the face of contrary facts, they endure a severe mental schizophrenia. Secular mysticism. We still live in the shadow of Kant. In What is Thought, computer scientist Eric Baum argues that the mind is essentially a computer program produced by evolutionary processes. Thus, free will is an illusion. The logical argument is airtight, Baum insists. Astonishingly, he then adds, but who really cares for all practical purposes? It's much more reasonable and practical for my genes to build me believing in free will and for me to act and think as if I have free will. It is a useful fiction. But a useful fiction is still a fiction, and to hold it when your own worldview denies it is irrational. We might even call it a form of secular mysticism. Baum admits as much. Free will is a very useful theory for describing human behavior, as he writes. Yet it is still wrong. To be precise, it is not even wrong, because it cannot be given any logical interpretation, at least not within his worldview. Thus Baum concludes, the belief is simply mystical. One group of thinkers has even been labeled Mysterians. They argue that human intelligence is simply not equipped to solve the mystery of consciousness, that it evolved to solve purely practical problems like obtaining food and making tools. A representative of this group, Colin McGuinn, writes, consciousness must have evolved from matter, somehow, but nothing we could contrive or imagine seems to offer the faintest hope for explanation. We just don't have the faculties of comprehension that would enable us to remove the sense of mystery. Francis Schaeffer, in The God Who Is There, observes every worldview containing a two-story dualism leads ultimately to mysticism in the sense that it adheres that its adherents must affirm truth that their own worldview cannot rationally explain. It is ironic that many thinkers who pride themselves on being champions of rationality have accepted a form of mysticism, driven to the extreme position by the impulse to suppress the facts that contradict their preferred worldview. Darwinian psychopaths. Romans 1 says God gives people up to pursue their idols even further, increasing the gap between what they profess and what they practice. We can picture worldviews falling along a continuum. The more consistently people work out their logic of their worldview, the more reductionistic the result will be, the wider the gap, and the farther its leap into irrational mysticism. The choice facing them becomes ever clearer. Will they follow the evidence of general revelation, or will they cling to their theories in the face of the evidence? Let's follow a series of examples to watch for ourselves how the gap grows ever wider and more disturbing. We begin with Singerland, now let's see where he ends. As a Darwinist and a materialist, he acknowledges that his reductionistic view of humans as essentially robots is contrary to ordinary experience. It is alien and often repugnant from any sort of normal human perspective. Gesturing towards his own daughter, Singerland writes, "At an important and ineradicable level, the idea of my daughter as merely a complex robot carrying my genes into the next generation is both bizarre and repugnant to me." Such a reductionistic view inspires in us a kind of emotional resistance and even revulsion. Indeed, he writes, if you do not feel that revulsion, something is wrong with you. There may well be individuals who lack this sense, and who can quite easily and thoroughly convince of themselves and other people in purely instrumental and mechanistic terms, but we label such people as psychopaths, and quite rightly try to identify them and put them away somewhere to protect the rest of us. What can we say when someone urges us to adopt a view of humanity that he himself admits is bizarre and repugnant? A view that ought to inspire revulsion, and a view of so dangerous that when acted on, it would justify us in labeling people psychopaths and locking them up. There is a severe clash between what his Darwinian materialism tells him in the downstairs and what his lived experience tells him in the upstairs. Which one will he accept as true? To describe this clash, we've been using the term cognitive dissonance, but that word may be too tame. This is a searing contradiction. Paul writes that those who build their lives on idols become futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts are darkened. Romans 1:21. The Greek word for futile means unproductive, ineffectual, failing to achieve its purpose. As an example clearly shows, idol-based worldviews do not produce what a philosophy of life is meant to give us, a coherent, logically satisfying worldview that makes sense of all of life. The Greek word for foolish reinforces the theme. Its root, synemi, means to synthesize, to put things together in the mind, and therefore to understand, to be wise. Thus, to be foolish is to fail to connect ideas or link them into a meaningful structure, a coherent whole. Scripture is giving a spot-on description of the fragmented, fractured, internally contradictory two-story worldviews that result from embracing idols. No wonder Paul writes that those who reject the Creator are without excuse. Romans 1:20. The phrase means without a defense, and it originally referred to a legal defense in a courtroom. In the Greek, the word is anapologetos, which has the same root for the word apologetics. The passage implies that those who adopt creator substitutes end up with two-story worldviews that are not defensible as logically consistent, coherent, or realistic. Their worldviews do not fit reality as they themselves experience it. The strength of this approach is that it shows why worldviews fail on their own terms. It is rarely persuasive to criticize other views from within your own perspective. All that really shows is that those other views disagree with you. Instead, you must step imaginatively inside other perspectives to show from within why they lack explanatory power. MIT Prof. My children are machines. When God gives people up to their idols, they experience a growing conflict between their worldview and their lived reality. When I teach these concepts in the classroom, an example my students find especially poignant is Flesh and Machines by Rhodey Brooks, Professor Emeritus at MIT. Brooks writes that a human being is nothing but a machine, a big bag of skin full of biomolecules, interacting by the laws of physics and chemistry. In ordinary life, of course, it is difficult to actually see people that way. But he says, when I look at my children, I can, when I force myself, see that they are machines. Is that how he treats them, though? Of course not. This is not how I treat them. I interact with them on an entirely different level. They have my unconditional love, and the furthest one might be able to get from rational analysis. Certainly, if what counts as rational is a materialist worldview in which humans are machines, then loving your children is irrational. It has no basis within Brooks' worldview. It sticks out of his box. How does he reconcile such a heart-wrenching cognitive dissonance? He doesn't. Brooks ends by saying, I maintain two sets of inconsistent beliefs. He has given up on any attempt to reconcile his theory with his experience. He has abandoned all hope for a unified, logically consistent worldview. He has no defense. This is the tragedy of the postmodern age. The things that matter most in life, that are necessary for humane society, ideals like moral freedom, human dignity, even loving our own children, have been reduced to nothing but useful fictions. They are tossed into the attic, which becomes a convenient dumping ground for anything that a materialist paradigm cannot explain. The Bible teaches that without God, people are morally lost, but they are also intellectually lost because they are trying to live within the limits of a worldview that is too cramped and narrow to account for their own humanity. They are forced to place their entire hope for dignity and meaning in an upper story realm that they themselves regard as irrational and unknowable, nothing but necessary falsehoods. Tragically, over time, those humane ideals will inevitably lose their hold. After all, we are made in God's image as logical beings, thus we tend to follow the logical consequences of our premises. It is psychologically impossible to accept concepts that we regard as fictions, no matter how useful. If someone like Brooks genuinely thinks his children are just mechanisms operating by whirring gears, that conviction will eventually erode the unconditional love he feels for them. If leadership classes in a society genuinely think people are machines, that conviction will eventually erode political liberty. Idols have practical consequences. Chesterton, Christianity, Too Good to Be True. Today, Christians have an unprecedented opportunity to present the biblical worldview as positive and life-affirming. If you begin with matter operating by blind mechanical forces, then logically humans cannot ultimately be anything but complex mechanisms. Your starting assumptions limit the categories available to you. But if you begin with a transcendent personal agent, then you have a perfectly logical explanation for why humans are likewise personal agents. The cause is adequate to the effect. The very phenomena that are so problematic for scientific materialism, like free will, consciousness, love, can be logically accounted for within a Christian worldview. No part of human experience falls outside its categories. Nothing sticks out of the box. The human person is no longer a misfit in a deterministic world. There is no division into an upper and lower story because you don't need a mystical attic to stash things that don't fit into your worldview. Christianity continues to affirm the unity of truth as coherent, logically consistent whole. In Christ, all things hold together. Colossians 1:17. G.K. Chesterton wagers that secularists reject Christianity not because it is a bad theory, but because it seems too good to be true. For the materialist, the universe is a universal prison. It shackles humans in an interlocking chain of cause and effect. Thus, when a secularist encounters the biblical view, it is like believing in fairyland to believe in such freedom. If secularists find Christianity incredible, Chesterton concludes, this is because it is so incredibly positive in affirming a high view of human freedom and dignity. Secular thinkers often criticize Christianity for being irrational, yet, ironically, today it is a biblical worldview that coheres in a logically consistent system. It liberates us from cognitive dissonance, imparting a profound inner unity and peace. It accords with a natural human longing for a life of integrity and wholeness. The word integrity comes from the Latin word for wholeness. When talking with secular people, we can show them how Christianity fulfills their own highest hopes and ideals. Of course, not everyone who accepts materialism or naturalism goes on to accept determinism, but I suggest that's only because they are not as careful to work out the logical outcome of their premises. Often people accept ideas that sound attractive or sophisticated, but do not follow those ideas all the way to their final implications. By giving examples of scientists and philosophers, like those we have met in principle number 3, we can provide a reality check. People are more likely to be persuaded when they learn the negative consequences of materialism and atheism from the writings of materialists and atheists themselves. Walking off the postmodern map. So far, we have applied the practical test to Enlightenment worldviews. What happens when we apply principle number 3 to the other side of the coin, the continental tradition that stems from the Romantic movement? As we saw earlier, instead of absolutizing the lower story, matter, philosophical idealism absolutizes the upper story, the mind. It claims that ultimate reality is the mental realm of ideas. Schopenhauer describes idealism by saying it takes the eternal truths that were the foundation of all previous philosophy, investigates their origin, and then finds this to be in man's head. But if the internal truths really are in man's head, then the logical conclusion is that they are not eternal after all. They are merely human constructs, relative and changing. In our day, postmodernism has drawn that conclusion. It holds that humans have no access to an objective or extra-mental world. In Rorty's second phrase, truth is made rather than found. If materialism keeps its old trunks in the attic, we might say postmodernism keeps its old trunks in the basement, labeled with postmodern jargon like logocentric, post-colonistic, meta-narrative, and false consciousness. Let's ask the same question we posed to Enlightenment worldviews. Does postmodernism account for the facts of universal human experience? Can it be lived without contradiction in the real world, or does it lead to an untenable dualism? The answer is that in practice, postmodernists do not live consistently on the basis of their own philosophy. They do not treat all ideas as human constructs. Instead, like every other normal person, they test their mental concepts against extramental states of affairs in dozens of ways. They thought the bread was in the refrigerator but found it on the counter. They thought their keys were on the table but found it in their pocket. How? By comparing their internal thoughts with the state of affairs in the external world. In everyday life, postmodernists are just as concerned about objective truth as anyone else. Dallas Willard comments, I have noticed that the most emphatic of postmodernists turn coldly modern when discussing their fringe benefits or other matters that make a great difference to their practical life. If we use the metaphor that a worldview is a mental map, postmodernists keep walking off their map. It is too small to account for the full geography of who they are. As we saw in principle number 2, postmodernism is a form of anti-realism, the view that reality is a social construction. Yet humans cannot help but functioning as though the external world is real and our knowledge of it is basically reliable. Those who deny that we have access to an external reality still look both ways before crossing the street. They avoid jumping off balconies. They hold their breath underwater. In other words, they know that there is an extra-mental reality to which they must adapt their behavior, otherwise the consequences will be disastrous. We all learn this basic truth from the time we are tiny. As toddlers, when we bump into the wall or trip over our chair and crash to the floor, we discovered in a painful way that the universe has an objective structure. When the toy box did not contain the toy we wanted, we discovered that reality does not bend to our subjective desires. Anything that we are compelled to affirm, simply in order to function in the world, is part of general revelation. Christianity explains why truth is not merely a human construction. The world is not a creation of my own mind. It is the handiwork of God. The human mind cannot usurp the Creator's role and function. The biblical concept of creation gives logical grounds to support what humans inescapably conclude by experience from the time we are toddlers. Remarkably, Rorty concedes that the very idea of objective truth, a truth that is out there, makes sense only on the basis of a Christian worldview. The suggestion that truth is out there is a legacy of an age in which the world was seen as the creation of a being who has had a language of his own, a non-human language, written into the cosmos. Rorty is hearkening back to an image that Christians have embraced since the Church Fathers, the idea that there are two books, the books of God's Word, the Bible, and the book of God's world, nature. And because the world itself is a kind of book, there is a message and a meaning written in the cosmos itself. Humans should be able to read certain fundamental truths in creation. We should be able to discern evidence for God in general revelation, just as Romans teaches. Don't impose your facts. Earlier we learned that all idols lead to a mental dichotomy or dualism, and postmodernism is no exception. Philosopher William Lane Craig points out that virtually no one applies postmodernism consistently across the board. People are not relativistic when it comes to matters of science, engineering, and technology. Rather, they are relativistic and pluralistic in matters of religion and ethics. In short, they apply postmodern skepticism selectively. Think of it this way. We often hear people say, "Don't impose your religion on me." But you never hear people say, "Don't impose your facts on me." Why not? Because facts are assumed to be objective and universal, binding on everyone. The upshot is that most people function as modernists and postmodernists, depending on the situation. When dealing with religion and morality, most people no longer think in terms of true and false. They no longer look to religion for an explanatory system to answer the cosmic questions of life. Instead, they choose a religion the way they choose a wallpaper pattern or an item on the menu, says philosopher Ernest Geller. It has become an area of life where it is considered acceptable to act on the basis purely of personal taste or feelings. By contrast, Geller says, when serious issues are at stake, like making money or meeting medical needs, then people want solutions based on real knowledge. They want to know the tested outcomes of objective science and research. What this means is that most people live fragmented lives. In the primitive world of home, church, and relationships, they operate on a postmodern view of truth as subjective and relative. But in the public world of work, business, finance, they operate on a modernist view of truth as objective and variable. In short, they no longer live as whole persons with a consistent, coherent philosophy of life. No wonder philosopher Louis Dupre says that the central challenge for our age is the lack of an integrating truth. We experience our culture as fragmented. We live on bits of meaning and lack the overall vision that holds them together as a whole. As a result, people feel an intense need for self-integration. Christianity has the power to integrate our lives and create a coherent personality structure, but only if we embrace it as the ultimate, capital T, truth that pulls together the lesser truths. Our contentment to Christian truth cannot simply remain one discrete part of life. Dupre says, it must integrate all other aspects of existence. Anything less is neither beautiful nor compelling enough to ignite our passion and transform our character. A Harvard professor's admission. I once delivered a presentation that included several of the examples in this chapter. Afterward, a Harvard professor came up to me from the audience, visibly upset. After all, I had criticized the work of the university professors at places like Harvard, his own colleagues. They know their theories don't explain ordinary life outside the lab, he said emphatically. But why throw it in their faces? The first thing that struck me was that he had let slip an amazing admission. These scientists and philosophers know that their theories do not fit the real world. In Romans 1, Paul says, the testimony of general revelation is knowable by everyone. Was this professor unwittingly confirming what Paul says? When we read Romans 1 that those who worship idols are without excuse, those words may seem harsh. In this chapter, however, we have met several scholars who openly acknowledge that their reductionistic theories clash with the facts of experience. They are aware, at some level, that they harbor a severe contradiction. Derek Parfit says that this type of inner conflict is actually quite common. Addressing his fellow philosophers, he writes, at a reflective or intellectual level, we may be convinced that some view is true, but at another level, one that engages more directly with our emotions, we may continue to think and feel as if some other view were true. He concludes, many of us, I suspect, have such inconsistent beliefs about the metaphysical questions that concern us most, such as free will, consciousness, and self. How do philosophers justify living with inconsistent beliefs? Yale professor Carsten Harries ventures to say many hold a double truth theory. They are hardwired to hold certain ideas as true in terms of first-person experience, but they hold the same ideas to be false according to science. Here's how Harries puts it. As intelligent agents, we are compelled to believe certain things, most importantly that our will is free, that we ourselves that persist through time, that there are moral truths that can be universalized, beliefs which as individuals committed to science we yet know to be false. That is, false according to the materialist conception of science. You would think that when people realize they hold inconsistent beliefs, that they would look for better ones. As we have seen, however, many scholars entrench themselves even more deeply in their reductionism. To acknowledge the evidence from general revelation would point them toward the biblical God, and so they suppress the evidence. Fascinatingly, there are even a few who admit that getting rid of God is precisely the goal of their reductionistic theories. Take Francis Crick, who became a household name after he and James Watson discovered the double helix structure in DNA. Crick freely admits that he sought out reductionistic theories because he wanted to discredit religion. I went into science because of these religious reasons. There's no doubt about that, he said in an interview. I asked myself what were two things that appear inexplicable, and are used to support religious beliefs. The two things he decided were the origin of life, physical nature, and the consciousness, human nature. His goal was to explain away both of them by reducing them to physical, chemical causes. In the same interview, Watson also expressed his religious motivation. The discovery of the double helix, he said, gives grounds for thinking that the powers held traditionally to be the exclusive property of the gods might be one day ours. At least for some people, the purpose of the proposing reductionist theories is to deny the Creator and to approximate his divine power. Secularism is too small for secularists. The second thing that struck me about the Harvard professor's comment was that he characterized an analysis of someone's worldview as throwing it in their faces. The goal of testing worldviews should never be attack those who hold them, but to open their minds to a better alternative. People often hold half-baked ideas that they would reject if they understood more clearly where those ideas lead. So they erect a kind of buzzer zone to protect themselves from recognizing the illogical and inhumane consequences of their worldviews. An effective method of apologetics can be to gently press people to think more critically by peeling away the protective layers so they can see the implications of their views more clearly. Only then will they be truly free to make tough choices about their fundamental convictions. When pressing people to the logic of their conclusions, however, we must act with love and empathy, for when people feel the full force of their views, it can be deeply unsettling. Scripture says that when Paul noticed that the many idols dotting the landscape in Athens, he was provoked, a word that is also translated stirred, distressed, troubled, or grieved. Acts 17:16. A Christian's motive in apologetics should be a God-inspired grief for the lost. We should be broken-hearted over the dehumanizing reductionisms that dishonor and destroy our fellow human beings. We should weep for people whose dark worldviews deny their life choices having meaning or moral significance. We should be moved by sorrow for people whose education has taught them that their loves, dreams, and highest ideals are ultimately nothing but electrical impulses jumping across the synapses of their brains. We should mourn for postmoderns who think that, as Schopenhauer said, the eternal truths are only in one's head. When talking to people trapped in a secular worldview, we can help them to see that it gives no basis for the realities of life that they themselves care most about. The very fact that they cannot live within its cramped confines is a sign that they were made to live in a larger, richer, conceptual universe. Secularism is too small for secularists. We should begin by expressing solidarity with their deepest longings for meaning and significance, and then show that in a biblical worldview. Those longings are not merely illusions or useful fictions, but living realities. We often hear stereotypes that Christianity is negative and repressive, that it regards human nature as corrupt and worthless, that it places little value on life in this world. But in reality, the Christian worldview has a much higher view of human life than any competing system. It gives a logical basis for the facts of experience that are denied by the dominant secular worldviews of our day. Freedom, creativity, love, personal significance, and genuine truth. How can we be anything but loving and joyful in communicating such a life-giving message? Another common negative stereotype is that Christianity is irrational and obscurant. In the next chapter, you will learn how to turn the tables on that charge, to show that in reality, it is idols that lead to irrational and self-contradictory worldviews. You will learn a simple yet devastating strategy to demonstrate how idolatrous worldviews shoot themselves in the foot. The end of principle number 3.